I want to discuss something really interesting. It's death and resurrection of Christ according to Gospels and him not dying according to the Quran. If you look at it, it might seem like a clear contradiction and completely irreconcilable contradiction. But that's not the case. In fact, I'll argue that there is no contradiction. Not only that, both these narratives reinforce each other and basically encode the same information. To do that, we have to first see what sentences are. Sentences are linguistic structures to encode information, and they're comprised of words. That's what sentences are. But words don't have fixed meaning. The meaning of word changes, and words undergo semantic shift. So, for example, and due to this semantic shift, it is possible to use two different sentences to encode the same information. For example, if I said a sentence in past, if I said the following sentence in past, I only eat meat from trees. And if I say a sentence today, I do not eat meat, I'm a vegetarian. Both these sentences have identical information because the word meat has undergone semantic shift. It has changed in its meaning from being any food in the past to just being the flesh of animals as it's defined today. Now let's look at, to understand what Quran is saying and what Gospels are saying, let's first look at what death is. Death is not a single phenomena. Death has had a varying, the word death has represented multitude of phenomena. So, for example, the simplest definition of death was vital signs going off. Possibly that was the definition used in 1st century Roman Empire. A more sophisticated definition of death would be heart stopping. Now we define death as brain dead, as a destruction of tissue, destruction of brain. Some people have argued that even that should not be the definition of death. We should just limit the definition of death to the destruction of cerebral cortex, because that's where human personality is localized. The most sophisticated definition of death that is used only in cryonics at present is called information theoretical death. Information theoretical death is defined as a death in which you have irreversible loss of consciousness due to destruction of brain tissue to such a degree that you cannot retrieve information using even any futuristic technology. So you can see that the word death doesn't represent one thing, it represents a whole series of things. But you could come up with a counter argument and say, well, whatever death represented in 1st century Rome, that would be possibly identical to what death represented in 6th century Arabia. That would have been true if Quran did not have its own definition of death. You see in Quran, in I think it's chapter 39 verse 42, that it defines death as, it defines sleep as a reversible loss of soul and consciousness from the body, and defines death as an irreversible loss of soul and consciousness. So you can see that Quranic definition of death is a tautology. Even if you're cut into 1,000 pieces, and somehow your consciousness is restored, then according to Quran you never died, you were just sleeping. But this is very different from the 1st century Roman definition of death, which is just vital signs off, possibly heart stopping. Now, with this understanding that the definition of death undergoes a semantic shift between the way Romans talk and the language of Quran, let's see how we can encode a certain information in both these languages. A person is crucified, his vital signs go off, possibly his heart stops, and then his vital signs go on again. How would you encode this information using the Roman definition of death? You would say he died and was resurrected from the dead. How would you formulate this information if you take Quranic's more strict definition of death, which is irreversible loss of consciousness? You would say, well, if he was revived, he can't, if he was revived, then he did not have an irreversible loss of consciousness. So you would say that he did not die, but it was just made to appear so. So you can see that both Gospels and Quran are basically encoding the same information. So the difference is not in the information Gospels and Quran is encoding. The difference is in a semantic shift between Quranic definition of death and a Roman definition of death. That is it. So apart from the surface similarity, there is something deeper going on here. You see, in Christianity, Christ has a human body, a human soul, and a human will. But his human will is completely aligned to the divine will, the divine word of God. So much so that the divine word of God is called the second nature of Christ, and he is called the word of God. Now, when people wanted to kill Christ, his enemies wanted to kill Christ, they didn't want to kill Christ the man. They could have easily killed him. They wanted to kill the word of God. They wanted to kill Christ the message. And they devised a plan for it. They thought they will try to kill Christ in a way which would be deemed cursed to his immediate followers, and that way they can argue that he couldn't possibly be the Messiah. His interpretation of Judaism couldn't possibly be true because he has died a cursed death according to Jewish law. But hiding in their plan was a meta plan of God, as it says in Quran. They planned and God is the best of planners. So hiding in their plan was this meta plan of God, that they wanted to discredit Christ through crucifixion. But what they ended up doing through crucifixion and what followed it was that they ended up not only proving the truthfulness of Christ's claim, the followers of Christ became so spiritually charged due to crucifixion and what followed it, that they ended up converting the whole Roman Empire. So if you think about it, they were not really crucifying Christ when they were crucifying Christ. They were crucifying themselves. They were crucifying the Roman Empire. They were crucifying Roman barbarity. They were crucifying Roman cruelty. They were not really crucifying Christ. Because even though it appeared so, something very deep was going on there. Now with that understanding, if you read this verse in Quran, you can see the beauty and depth in it. It says, they said in boast, we killed Christ, the son of Mary, the apostle of God. So you can see that they're saying, we killed the word of God, we killed the word of God. But then the Quran continues and says, but they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it was made to appear so. So you can see that there is a deep spiritual message here. And the spiritual message is basically what we should be focused on. Before I end this video, I would like to make one clarification, that there is a rather strange theory out there that Christ was replaced by Judas on the cross. Now this theory doesn't come from Quran, it doesn't even come from Hadith, it doesn't come from any Islamic source. It comes from something called a forgery called the Gospel of Barnabas. Gospel of Barnabas is a 16th century forgery. There is no debate about it. The only debate is whether it's a 14th century forgery or it's a 16th century forgery, whether the forgery was done in Rome or the forgery was done in Istanbul. That's a debate. But there's no debate about Gospel of Barnabas being a forgery. And that is where this substitution theory comes from. So it's not an Islamic theory. Muslims should just refrain from it. Everybody should refrain from it. It's a very strange kind of theory that Jesus was replaced by Judas on the cross. Rather, refraining from it, they should try to look at deeper meanings of both Gospels and Quran. And as I said, Gospels and the Gospel narrative of crucifixion and the Quranic narrative of crucifixion reinforce each other. And that is the meaning we should be after. Thank you.